Thus, the 1st of December marks a day on which slavery was officially abolished in the British Empire. The Cape Colony, today the Western Cape Province, formed part of this British Empire. The abolishment meant that people who were kept as slaves were no longer required to perform compulsory labor without compensation. For more on this, I'm joined by Newzroom Damon from Izigo Museums of South Africa. Newzroom, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, it's hard to wrap one's head around the idea, or actually the fact, that people were seen as commodities, as objects to be owned. And that's the story of slavery in the British Empire, and more importantly, here locally. Tell us a bit more about this history.
Yes, good afternoon, Klein, and thank you for inviting us to your show this afternoon. When we talk about slavery in South Africa, I know when we look at history and when historians speak about slavery in South Africa, they usually mention slavery in Cape Town. What we need to do as a South African people is that we need to embrace as South Africans the idea of slavery. You know, when we go to Britain or we go to America, African Americans, they are very much aware of their slave ancestry, and it's always mentioned about slavery. In South Africa, however, we tend to remove ourselves from our slave history and we tend to think more about apartheid. So in Cape Town, for example, we have the Izigo Slave Lodge Museum, which is the second oldest building in South Africa, and also the space where the majority of the company slaves were housed during the slave period. So when we speak about emancipation, you will find that in South Africa, many people don't really know about Emancipation Day. When we talk about celebrating emancipation, the first thing when we mention the 1st of December is people, especially South Africans, will think of World AIDS Day, except those activists and those people who are really interested in their slave history and their slave ancestry. They are the ones who will first, when we talk about 1st of December, will first think about Emancipation Day. So as a nation, I feel that we really should be looking more into our slave history and our slave ancestry. And we will find that, especially when it comes to Emancipation Day, we have a very small focus, and it's usually Cape Town history, Cape Town emancipation of slavery. We need to think of it as South African slavery and South African history as such.
Now, I was very
So
fortunate to visit
yes.
Ghana a few years ago and actually travel to the Cape Coast and see some of these castles where slaves were being kept and later transported to various parts of the world, including the Americas. But why is it important for others, for more people to learn about this kind of history, especially for young people?
It's especially important for South Africans, Klantla, to understand enslavement and to understand our history. Because we are so connected to our apartheid history, we kind of forget where our roots are from as South Africans. We must remember, as South Africans, our slave ancestry is from the African continent. I know in terms of our stereotypical understanding of slavery, and when we speak about slavery, it's always the enslaved that was brought from the Malay Peninsula, and we talk about the Malay slaves. But we must also remember that our people, our history is so unique in terms of the fact that we are the only country where Africans had been enslaved within the African continent. So it was enslaved that was brought from Africa to Southern Africa where they were enslaved. And when we talk about emancipation, we need to understand that when we talk about the fight for freedom, we did not gain our freedom with Emancipation Day. You know, when the British and when speak about emancipation, we think that on the 1st of December, that was the end of slavery in South Africa. We need to understand the terminology that we use within South Africa when we talk about slavery. When we talk about the end of slavery in South Africa with emancipation on the 1st of December, we must remember it was the emancipation in terms of chattel slavery. We need to understand that there's different kinds of slavery and that enslavement still took place within South Africa after the emancipation took place. You had those prize Negroes that were brought to South Africa. We have the indentured slaves that were brought to the sugarcanes people, they call it indentured labor. But what was indentured labor all about? So those are the kind of questions we need to ask. And in the slave lodge, Izigo Slave Lodge, we are now moving towards that kind of history where we start asking those uncomfortable questions. We are looking at what was slavery all about. You know, when we talk about slavery and we talk about the British slavery and we talk about Dutch slavery, we always say that it was an economic slavery. But what we must also remember is it was a racism thing. It was about race. It was blacks that were enslaved. And we need to put more emphasis on that so that we understand where apartheid also came from. And so that we also understand that with this freedom that we are celebrating now, and the fact that we can look back on an emancipation, we must remember that even though those enslaved were emancipated, there was a 4-year period where they still needed to work for the master, and they were indentured for that period of time. And then they were indentured labor after that. So when did slavery then actually stop? Because we don't see an actual stop space when we talk about enslavement and when we talk about an apartheid that still continued. So we need to actually keep those things in mind in Nhlanhla when we talk about slavery.
Yeah, so this is obviously a process that happened over time. But do historians know how long it actually took before slavery was eliminated, at least in South Africa?
Nhlanhla, when it comes to South African slavery and historians and the researchers, you know, the research continue. And especially with South Africa, there's we're a little bit behind in terms of doing the research. We have those historians that have dedicated many years to the study of slavery, but obviously people have their own fields in terms of what specifically they look at when they are studying slavery. So the new historians, the new young historians that are coming up, they need to actually look at those issues in terms of emancipation and in terms of when did slavery really end, how do we define slavery, what kinds of slavery there was. So Nhlanhla, that is still an ongoing research that is taking place within South Africa.
But there's still quite a pressing a question that's still being asked today as to whether are they still slaves and slavery today. Now, modern day slavery is a multi-billion-dollar industry with just the forced labor aspect generating about 150 billion rand each year. Take us through some of your research specifically on modern day slavery.
Nhlanhla, in terms of modern day slavery, at the moment is we at Iziko is still busy with that kind of research, and obviously we need to take note and keep up with the latest research that is being done. So currently we're still in the process of looking at that kind of research, and we are looking at what historians are coming up with so that we can actually put it up in our exhibitions. And that is why we usually have these public programs where we invite people to come and actually give voice to what is happening out there. So in our case, in terms of Ezekiel, that is how we try and stay on trend with the research that we are doing.
And before we wrap up, how do people get in touch with you and just interact with your programs as well?
We have a public program division. We are called the Zico Education and Public Programs. And so you can either contact W. Kasibe at iziko.org.za with regards to our public programs, or you can contact us on info@iziko.org.za, or you can go to our website www.iziko.org.za